Hello class, this is your Unit 7 and 8 review guide. We may be taking the Unit 7 and 8 review guide digitally, so I'll keep you posted on that. We're going to be looking at different solutions to taking the AP test, but the AP test is still on for May 14th, so please continue to review, continue to watch my YouTube videos, other YouTube videos, reading the Princeton Review guide, etc., and practicing writing essays and writing them quickly and efficiently. That should definitely help. So without further ado, we'll get into the Unit 7 and 8 review. The first thing we're going to talk about is World War I. So World War I started on August 1st, 1914, ended November 11th, 1918. At the start of the war, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, Russia, plus Serbia and Belgium, faced the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy, Romania, the United States, and others later joined the Entente. Turkey and Bulgaria joined the Central Powers. Ultimately, the Entente defeated the Central Powers. World War I was the bloodiest war in history to that point. By one estimate, 25,955,000 people died, or approximately 13 million military and 13 million civilians died. World War I unleashed an avalanche of violence that pervaded the 20th century. We'll talk about that when we get to the consequences section of World War I. So the causes of World War I are still a hot topic for historians. There are some that blame Germany because of its expansionist motives, or Germany because they were trying to possibly incite a war in the Balkans. Whether they thought it would become a full-blown world war is up for debate. There's some evidence to that. There are some that blame, on the contrary, Great Britain, France, and Russia for encircling, so to speak, for threatening the security of Germany and making Germany feel insecure and therefore leading to an arms buildup. But for our purposes, we're just going to ignore those debates, and we're just going to talk about the main causes of World War I. So MAIN stands for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So militarism caused the war. Before 1914, European societies were swept by a widespread popular glorification of war and all things military. So Europe's militaries gained undue influence over foreign policy, which they used to press for war. These public attitudes and military influence on policy caused the war. So we talked about the dangers of excessive veneration of the military, excessive worship of the military, and we see that on display today. We know those politicians that are militaristic, and even fellow students that are very militaristic at IDEA San Benito. So alliances caused the war. The major European powers were dragged into a local Balkan dispute by Europe's encompassing system of competing international alliances. The war stemmed from a local Balkan dispute between Serbia and Austria. Remember, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, and this was a local dispute, but the rest of Europe was dragged into this dispute because they were allied with Serbia or Austria, or with one of their allies, and hence were compelled to join the war. Imperialism caused the war. By 1914, the major European powers had long contested for control of overseas empire for several centuries. This competition continued in the decades before 1914. As manifest in the Fashoda crisis of 1898 and the Moroccan crises of 1905-06 and 1911, in which European powers nearly came to blows over control over the Upper Nile region in Morocco. The July 1914 crisis that produced World War I also stemmed from such rivalries for colonies. Nationalism caused the war. Malignant, supercharged nationalism and nationalist myth-making fueled expansionism and conflict throughout Europe, causing the war. The rise of nationalist feeling among stateless European peoples led them to demand their own states. This fueled conflict among the major powers. Most notably, it led Serbia to seek unifying the Serbian people with other South Slavic people under Serb control. Hence, Serbia sought to subvert and dismember Austria-Hungary, where many South Slavs lived. The rise of nationalism also magnified divisions among Austria-Hungary's 11 nationalities, leading Austrian elites to fear that Austria might be torn apart by foreign subversion and to lash out against Serbia when Serbia pursued such subversion. This brought Austria and Serbia into collision, and thereby brought Austria into collision with Russia, which supported Serbia in part from pan-Slavic nationalist sentimentality. Chauvinist and nationalist myth-making across Europe fueled a spirit of self-entitlement and contempt for others. This fostered belligerence and expansionism, especially in Germany, Serbia, and Russia. Also remember that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. We talked about the conduct of World War One, trench warfare, machine guns, etc. How incredibly brutal it was, the horrible sleeping conditions, etc. At length in class, there's still a link to a New York Times video that describes it in detail, both in the PowerPoint. Check out the hyperlinks in the PowerPoint, and then I'll try to include it in the description below. So this is from the movie 1917. Also, you can see the casualties and the deaths, actually the fatalities of World War I in this image. You can see it pretty clearly. It's divided between the Entente powers, which later become the Allies, and the Central powers as well. So you can see that the Entente goes from Italy up, and then the Central powers are from, I think it's Austria, Germany down. So what are some of the outcomes of World War I? It toppled the Prussian, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, which are eventually divided up by the Entente powers. It sparks the Russian Revolution and Civil War, which I'll talk about in a bit, and gave rise to fascism in Italy and Germany, which is arguably a cause of World War II, and it leads to the Great Depression, another cause of World War II. The Russian Revolution begins in 1917 and leads to the early exit of Russia from World War I. The communists come to power, the Bolsheviks come to power, which are communists. Vladimir Lenin, after a short civil war, is installed as the leader of Russia, and then eventually Joseph Stalin. So in World War I, we see almost the origins of the Cold War, right? So the Cold War existed because of the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union, which gets established in World War I. The Russian Revolution is significant, and just to go and belabor this point that World War I is still significant to us today, the Russian Revolution eventually installs Stalin. This eventually leads to the Cold War between 1947 to 1989, which caused the Korean, Vietnam, Afghan, Angolan, and Nicaragua-Contra wars. All of those are interventions, killing millions more. The Vietnam War caused further trouble, including the rise of the Khmer Rouge to power in Cambodia in 1975 and their murder of 2 million Cambodians. The Afghan War of the 1980s caused the 1996 rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan, who sheltered al-Qaeda, leading to 9/11 and the current U.S. al-Qaeda war. Many argue that World War I also caused the rise of the Nazis in Germany, and thus both World War II and the Holocaust. World War II, in turn, caused the rise to power of communist governments in China, North Korea, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. So we'll talk about that in the next section. The Treaty of Versailles brought an official end to World War I. France and Britain wanted to cripple Germany economically. The resulting treaty was extremely punitive against Germany, and therefore is seen often as a cause of World War II. World War I, we see this push for the League of Nations, pushed by Woodrow Wilson to develop international laws and standards of fairness. It's an epic fail, in no small part because the United States refused to join it. Wilson couldn't persuade his isolationist Congress to join the League of Nations. So it is an epic fail. So the war renewed the hopes of people in colonies for independence. African and Asian colonial troops contributed thousands of soldiers to the Allied war effort, so they thought they'd be rewarded in some form. Also, when they went back, they gained a lot of experiences. They learned to see Europeans as extremely beatable. French colonial troops, for example, saw French soldiers dead in the battlefield, and they also experienced all kinds of inequalities while they fought for the European powers. So in that image, you can see Indian colonial troops fighting in World War I for Britain. So after World War I, European powers granted self-determination only to white countries in Eastern Europe. Middle Eastern lands that had been a part of the Ottoman Empire came under control of France and Britain in the League of Nations mandate system. So the mandate system was a system that basically said that Middle Easterners were not prepared for independence, but these powers were tasked, France and Great Britain, for instance, were tasked with helping guide them towards independence. So it was basically colonialism all over again. So, what did this mean? For a lot of people, they felt that Woodrow Wilson, who was seen as the hope for independence and freedom, was suddenly stabbed him in the back, essentially. And so we read an article about this, and I'm going to post the article here. It's called Woodrow Wilson and the Ugliest of Treacheries. Fascism is what's one such demon in the interwar period. It's an ideology, which is an action-oriented belief system. It's anti-democratic at its core. It thinks democracies are inherently weak and that they can cause instability in societies. It has this fixation on a rebirth of society. It thinks that violence can help cleanse society, etc. That's what fascism is all about. So it's a demon in the interwar period. It springs up in Italy first, and then in Germany in the period between World War I and World War II. There are many different causes of the Great Depression, and you can see a link in the bio from a History.com article that talks at length about it. But World War I could have been a cause of the Great Depression. The United States was very adamant that the European powers that it had lent money in World War I should repay them. It probably should have forgiven them of their debts, but the European powers struggled in repaying the United States. So that's one of the reasons why they slapped German war reparations in the Treaty of Versailles. This struggle to repay the United States helped kickstart economic disaster throughout Europe and the rest of the world. Also, the United States was very protectionist in the interwar period, meaning that it did not like to trade with other countries. It installed tariffs, and these tariffs caused economic disruptions throughout the world. So you can read that article below. Before we get into talking about the causes of World War II and the conduct of World War II, I want to talk about developments in Russia. So obviously the Russian Revolution starts in 1917. It leads to great instability in Russia. Here you can see an image of Vladimir Lenin speaking to the crowds in Moscow. There's great anger at the Tsarist political system, at the autocracy. Long story short, the Bolsheviks / the communists take power, and that's had consequences for the world ever since. So after after Lenin eventually dies in 1922, Stalin takes power, and so that's what we're going to focus on for a little while. So there's this great open Yale course lecture on the rise of Stalin and its impact on Russian society and the Soviet Union ever since. So Stalin was a dictator of the Soviet Union from 1929 to 1953. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union was transformed from a peasant society into an industrial and military superpower. However, he ruled by terror, and millions of his own citizens died during his brutal reign. So we're going to talk a little bit about Stalin today. So back to Lenin. So under Vladimir Lenin, Lenin instituted the new economic policy. Remember that Lenin comes into power when Russia is in disorder. The World War I wreaked all kinds of havoc on Russian society. And so as he and other Soviet leaders grappled with the country in virtual collapse, he recognized that the ideology of communism, which called for the abolition of private property, private ownership, and the destruction of the free market, would have to be sacrificed for the future. So you simply had to be able to feed people. You had to have peasants not hoarding what they produce or waiting for higher prices. You needed to have a free market system, basically. So the new economic policy is promulgated in March of 1921, and the features of it you can read about. Basically, the state maintains centralized control over the economy, and there's still centralized planning, but the NEP allows the peasants to use their land as if it was their own. And largely, in most cases, it still was, and allowed them to market their products and sell them at market prices in order to get food to people who needed it. Otherwise, they too would have died. The state maintained control over heavy industry, but this is all going to be just a small retreat along the road to socialism. It succeeded, it works. Gradually, the production of food reached pre-war levels and small-scale industrial production revives. Kulaks, that's a vocabulary term, were prosperous peasants. They were well-off peasants. During the period of the new economic policy, the kulaks, the people with land who had something to sell, did well indeed because their goods fetched good prices, and they did very well. With the gradual ending of the new economic policy, which sort of trickles to an end after Lenin, they would become targets in the mass collectivization campaigns that accompanied the 5-year plans, that is 1928 to 1933, and would be themselves victims of the purges, as we'll talk about in a bit. The tragedy, essentially the tragedy of the Russian Revolution. So Lenin's health falters. He has a series of stroke, and Stalin tries to consolidate power. So he tries to make it seem that he is Lenin's chosen successor and not Leon Trotsky. So Stalin, there's a lot of famous doctored photographs where Stalin has himself inserted next to Lenin. This is a Stalin-era propaganda poster where you can see on the leftmost side Karl Marx, and then Friedrich Engels, the writers of the Communist Manifesto, and then Vladimir Lenin, and then on the rightmost side, Joseph Stalin. Obviously, trying to indicate that Stalin was the chosen successor of all these great men in communist, especially Russian communist history. So let me just define Stalinism as a term. Stalinism is a set of tenets, policies, and practices that characterize the Soviet government during the period when Stalin is in power. So it's pretty obvious. Stalinism lasts until Stalin finally dies in 1953. So it really takes place from 1928 to 1953. So the beginning of the 5-year plan, that is 1928 to 1933, is really the beginning of Stalinism. So Stalinism involves state coercion and more than that, really, state terror, with the goal of transforming this still relatively backward society into a Soviet state that could sustain itself, that could build heavy industries. This was the obsession of Stalin and Stalinism, that heavy industries would have to be built, and that they would be built on the backs of the peasantry, who would lose their land and become industrial workers. There's massive urbanization, as we'll see, in the Soviet Union during this period. The obvious central characteristics of Stalinism, as you've already seen, are the abolition of private property, first of all, and the end of free trade, the end of the market. The market is to disappear. If you're abolishing private property in a vast state in which 2 generations before you still had serfs, what you want to do from their point of view is collectivize agriculture. The massive collectivization of agriculture, this would, as you know, become a characteristic of the satellite states in Eastern Europe and Eastern Central Europe with varying degrees in those states. The economy is planned, it's run in a centralized fashion and predicated upon mass industries, rapid industrialization, etc. Part of this was the liquidation, in quotation marks, not a nice word, of those exploiting classes. That is the bourgeois, the new economic policy men, the kulaks, the aristocrats, and the clergy. This involves deporting people to gulags or incarcerating them wherever they were, or incarcerating them in gulags. Gulags are basically concentration camps, work and labor camps. So there's the creation of large state-run farms rather than individual holdings. That's what collectivized agriculture is. The creation of large state-run farms rather than individual holdings. It allowed more efficient control over peasants. It's part of Stalin's economic and political planning, and it's often, as we've discussed, adopted in other communist governments. Stalin also employed the Purge. He terrorized his enemies. He was very paranoid. He cultivates this cult of personality around him. He becomes almost like a czar-like figure, and he establishes a totalitarian dictatorship. So I think 1984 talks about the totalitarian system, and it could refer to Nazi Germany or the USSR or the Soviet Union under Stalin. They were both totalitarian systems. It is used as a warning against the British from adopting a totalitarian system where all aspects of society are essentially controlled and watched by the state. Joseph Stalin purges people that disagree with him. He's a great example of totalitarian dictatorship. He locks them up. He sends them to gulags, which are forced workers' camps, etc. So 1984 is a really cool book. Before we get into World War II, I want to just talk a lot about the Russian Revolution and its depiction and allegories in Animal Farm, which is another book by George Orwell, and in Snowpiercer, which is a recent movie starring Chris Evans. So what is an allegory? An allegory is the expression by means of symbolic fictional figures and actions of truth or generalizations about human existence. So Animal Farm is really an allegory of the Russian Revolution, and so is, I think, Snowpiercer. They both encapsulate the idea that the Russian Revolution represented a lot of hope for the Russian people that were tired of the czarist political system, that wanted something new, that were hoping for something new, hoping to um, get a political system that truly cared for the needs of the many, not just the very few at the top, and were disappointed. Ultimately, they were disappointed by what they were left in place. So Animal Farm, I'm just going to introduce the characters. So Farmer Jones in Animal Farm obviously represents the old Tsarist political system. Comrade Napoleon represents Joseph Stalin, and Vladimir Lenin is represented by Old Major. So Joseph Stalin kind of corrupts the Russian Revolution in Orwell's retelling of events. I think that's a little bit unsophisticated, but I like its ability to kind of get across the main points of the Russian Revolution. Animal Farm begins after the revolution is initially successful at ousting Farmer Jones. It begins with the animals deciding on 7 commandments that will essentially govern the animals' existence and relationship between each other. The pigs take over the revolution, and by the end of the book, one of the most chilling pieces of the book, and actually I'm getting just goosebumps just thinking about it because this is the kind of nerdy stuff that makes me excited. By the end of the book, those commandments gradually get erased, and there's only one commandment left. And it says all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So it gets at this idea that this revolution that embodied, all these great ideas like equality, justice, and economic justice for people gets corrupted by the likes of in the book, Comrade Napoleon, but in real life, Joseph Stalin, who's this authoritarian figure that sets up a totalitarian system in the Soviet Union that abuses all kinds of people, sends people to gulags, etc. And the causes of World War II are kind of up in the air. There's a huge debate among historians about the causes of World War II, but generally the things that prevail are an economic crises, the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, aggressive expansionism. Both the Japanese Empire and the German Empire are for aggressive expansionism. And then there's stuff that are a little bit more abstract, like the absence of institutions. The League of Nations is just basically, it's this epic fail. It doesn't help prevent the war because it doesn't have enough power. The material capability of Germany to wage war. And what that means essentially is that Germany was still relatively okay. They were they were damaged by World War I, but not as significantly as France and Britain. World War I ends with Germany in France. So it's stuff like that that really kind of gets at this idea of the cause of World War II. Also, discontentment or anger by Germans at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The idea that Germany was the person placed as the person responsible, forced to pay war reparations, and this caused anger. Economic crises. All of these stuff are interrelated and interdependent causes of World War II, but certainly huge contributions. I have 2 slides on it, only because one is from a lecture from my college, Intro to International Relations, lecture about the causes of World War II, and then one is just something that I created from your AMSCO textbook. So take a look at both.